All right, good morning. Starting a couple minutes early here, but welcome to our next edition of Ask the Agronomist. Producer Adam and I are here in the Nutrient Studios south of Macomb, and we've got a list of things to cover today. But as always, we're hoping to answer your questions as well. So we'll go ahead and kind of kick off with a few topics that have kind of come up here in recent days. One of them not corn or soybean related, but since there's probably not going to be a lot of alfalfa producers watching this morning, we'll start off with the alfalfa weevil. So weevils are, very common. I was reading a little bit this morning. They're in the 48 continental states. There are problems, from time to time. It's been probably, I don't know, a couple people have told me 15 years or more since we've had the weevil pressure that we seem to be having this spring. So if you're noticing your alfalfa is looking a little worse by the day, probably is infested with weevils. And it's close enough to time to take your first cutting off. I wouldn't recommend spraying for it now. I would just get it harvested as quick as you can. Typically, the mowing, curing, drying, raking, baling process does a pretty good job of culturally eliminating the weevil. If you want to be on the safe side, maybe a few days after you get that cut and harvested, you could get in there with an insecticide application and clean up any stragglers that survive the mowing, raking, baling process. But just a heads up for you, if you haven't driven by your hayfield recently, you may be a little alarmed the next time you do. We mowed ours at home yesterday, and it's getting chopped and bagged today, hopefully. And that was probably the earliest I've ever mowed my first cutting of hay, but they were working it over pretty good. So keep your eyes out for that. If you're a hay producer, they don't bother clover, they don't bother grass, but if you've got pure stands of alfalfa, they are highly attracted to that. While we're on the subject of alfalfa, just briefly, if you've noticed all the yellow mustard growing in the alfalfa this year, it is possible, even if it's not Roundup Ready alfalfa, it is possible to control those winter annual weeds in your alfalfa stands with conventional herbicides. So keep that in the back of your mind. Nobody thinks about putting herbicide on alfalfa typically until it's too late to do anything about it. But if you want to raise some really high quality, clean, pure alfalfa, you can do weed control early in the spring to wipe out all that mustard. Mustard can really be damaging to hay in multiple ways from a quality and from a stand longevity standpoint. Cattle don't like to eat the stuff either. So if you get enough mustard in your hay, it really negatively affects the palatability of that hay crop. So if you're a little disappointed in how much mustard you're seeing in your hay stand this year, potentially you'll see even more next year because a lot of what you're seeing this year is probably going to produce seed. And as that stand gets older and thinner, other things start to move in. So keep that in mind for next spring. A little easier to do if it's Roundup Ready alfalfa, but even if you're raising conventional alfalfa, there are herbicide options to take care of that mustard. So just a quick alfalfa update. Don't get many alfalfa questions. I get a sorghum question every now and then, an alfalfa question every now and then, but mainly corn and soybeans is what we focus on. So I've been talking with several producers here in recent days that have made comments to me that they almost think their corn stands have gotten more uniform than they used to think they were. When things came up as slowly as they did and as challenged as they were in some areas, we got a lot of unevenness. I was getting a lot of questions from growers that were looking at stands that were less than perfect. Plus, they were uneven, and they were wondering, well, how much how big of a penalty should I factor in for that unevenness? And is that what tips the scale in the direction of maybe doing a replant? Maybe you had enough plants that you could have lived with that stand, but you didn't like the variation in size of plants. And how many of you have heard someone say over the years that if a corn plant is 2 leaves behind, it's a weed? That has been overblown a little bit, in my opinion. And yes, uniformity is great. The more uniform you can have a stand of corn, the better. If you're trying to win the NCGA yield contest, it is vitally important to have perfect uniformity. In the real world of just making a living raising 250, 260, 270 bushel corn, it doesn't have to be perfectly even to accomplish the yield goals that you have on your farm. The other thing that I think was a factor this year, if you think back to the growing conditions we were having in late April and early May, when we were getting up to, highs in the 50s, lows in the 30s and low 40s, we had a lot of days after planting where we accumulated either 0 heat units, 1, 2, maybe 3 heat units a day. And in a warm spring day, you can get 20 heat units. Well, this year it took a week, 10 days, maybe 2 weeks in some cases to get 20 heat units. So we were accumulating heat units extremely slowly. And if you're accumulating them that slowly, and this plant needed 10 heat units more to come up than the one next to it, it might have taken 5 days for this plant that needed another 10 heat units to get those 10 heat units. So that would mean those plants were 5 days apart in emergence, which is normally pretty devastating to a stand of corn to be that uneven. But if you think about the fact that this plant is only 10 heat units behind, in a normal warm spring day, that's about 12 hours worth of growing to get 10 heat units. So that plant that was 5 calendar days behind in emergence was only about 10 heat units behind in emergence. And if you think your stands have evened up versus what they used to look like, there's a couple things that could be going on there. It's possible that they weren't really as uneven as they appeared based on the very slow heat unit accumulation. The other thing is there is a bit of an optical illusion that happens, and the bigger the plants get, it's harder to see that leaf difference in size. So it could be that the field is still a little non-uniform. It's just harder to see the non-uniformity. It's also possible that it wasn't as alarmingly non-uniform as it looked like when it came up out of the ground. I see we had a question come in, Adam.
Yep.
I can't read it, but
yep, Tom had a good question related to what you're talking about, Lance. So
Yep.
He wants to know.
Thank you, Tom.
Is there a correlation between the length of emergence in corn and maybe your infection of crown rot?
Oh, good question. I'm going to put that in the long list of things that we don't know about crown rot, Tom. To be honest with you, we know that cold, wet conditions after planting certainly favor infection. I think the wet is probably more important than the cold. And generally speaking, we've been cold and dry this spring in most of my area. Now there are, isolated pockets that have had, torrential downpours. I know in Chris Callaw's area, they had places had 8 inches of rain. What, about 10 days ago, Adam, I think. So, there's places that haven't had 2 inches in the last 60 days. And there's places that have had significantly more than that. So I think moisture is key. Obviously stress is key. And Tom, this would probably be the best answer I could give to your question specifically, is that anything that adds stress to a plant is going to increase the likelihood that it's going to be negatively impacted by something. Now that's a pretty wishy-washy, general statement that doesn't tell you a whole hell of a lot. There's also really nothing we can do about it other than just try to make that plant's life as good as we can through the growing season, which brings up something that I wanted to mention about our V5 fungicide application timing, coming up, and post-emergence applications coming up. And if you do want to treat those plants as good as you can and do everything you can do to protect them from getting, waylaid by crown rot later in the season, The number one most effective thing we found in eliminating crown rot is actually the tassel time fungicide application. We've also seen benefits from that V5 timing application, and neither one of those applications is moving anything into the root. So neither of those applications is doing anything directly to prevent the pathogens that are causing crown rot. What they do is they alleviate stress on the plant, and they make that plant happier. They make that plant healthier. They make it less likely to get negatively impacted by other things that it's dealing with. So we have not found anything so far in a seed treatment, in an in-furrow application, in any fungicide that we have looked at that does a good job of directly preventing crown rot. We have been able to help alleviate the impacts of crown rot by reducing stress on the plant through the growing season. And the amount of stress that Mother Nature puts on the plant through the growing season has the biggest impact of all. So if you think back to 21, when we had plants that had, huge yield potential, and then ran into a brick wall of plant health issues, combined with some hot nights and some dry weather during grain fill and some normal stress during grain fill. And that 21 corn crop went from looking like $1 million to looking like, oh my gosh, what happened to my corn, in about a 10-day stretch in late August. That was, crown rot was in the background of everything that was going on that year. And with the tar spot and the southern rust and the other diseases and a little bit of heat, a little bit of dryness, it just really, really, really overwhelmed those plants. So where I see crown rot being an issue is typically in places that have weather stress during grain fill. We have some level of weather stress during grain fill every year. It's just a matter of, how severe was the stress. And if you have severe stress during grain fill, plus plants that had, ample opportunities early in the season to get infected with crown rot, and ample opportunity, I would define as it was planted early and then went through a lot of cold, wet weather after planting. That's giving you your best odds of those root systems having a lot of crown rot infection. The infection may or may not hurt much depending on what happens later in the season. But if you plant early and it's cold and wet after planting, and that plant spends a lot of days sitting there in a wet, cold, saturated soil condition, that seems to be the environment that is most likely to, allow crown rot to become a big deal. So soil type matters. The pathogens involved in crown rot, in my opinion, thrive in high organic matter soils. So crown rot, unfortunately, is a problem that good ground has that light timber soils typically do not have. You're not going to run into much crown rot on sand. You're not going to run into much crown rot on light timber soils. But that good black, even if it's patterned, even if you got $1,200 an acre worth of tile in it, those pathogens are living quite successfully and quite happily in that rich black soil environment. There's also correlations to high levels of fertility, which is also frustrating. So crown rot is kind of an insidious thing to me, because for the most part, everything you do to raise better corn is going to favor that pathogen, with the exception of spraying fungicide. Spraying fungicide isn't going to favor the pathogen. But farming good ground and having high levels of fertility and doing everything you can do to raise 300 bushel corn, that is going to create a pretty good environment for that pathogen. So Tom, I appreciate the question. Sorry, I don't have a direct answer to your question. To my knowledge, nobody has ever studied that. We could. I mean, we could mark those individual plants that came up late, and people have looked at the ear size on those individual plants that come up late. There is a dramatic reduction in ear size on those plants in some cases. How much of a factor crown rot is in that, I think most of us assume most of the reduction in ear size is just due to competition. But, to your question, if those plants struggled more, if they've got less healthy roots, That's just another stress to pile on that plant. Not only is it getting out competed by its neighboring plants that are bigger and older, maybe it has less healthy roots too. So possibility. Good question. Need somebody smarter than me to answer it. Anything else on the chat, Adam, before we dive back in?
Quiet right now.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, so while we're talking about corn roots, I do want to, and most of you have been through this in the past, and most of you know this is coming, but every year you've got that beautiful looking field of corn, V2, V3, nice color, pretty uniform. You row it nice when you drive by, and then for a period of time, every day it seems to get less uniform, and you get yellow spots, and you start seeing streaks, and you got this area here that doesn't look as good as that. And when it was V2, it just looked perfect. By the time it's V5, it's uneven, and it may be more uneven in color than it is in size. If you've got greener areas in the field, the greener areas make the yellow areas look horrible, right? So if you've ever sorted cattle and you start with a group of 10 calves in a pen, you can see the knotheads in the group. As soon as you get the best ones out of the pen, the worst ones seem to start looking better. So the same thing happens to a stand of corn. The corn that looks really good in your field is actually making the stuff that looks less good look even worse. If you've got a whole field that's uniformly mediocre, it looks fine, because you can't really tell it's mediocre when it's uniform. But when things get ununiform, your eye just concentrates on the stuff that looks bad. What's happening in that plant is at about V2 or V3, that's when the nodal roots start to form. And that's when that plant starts to get prepared to get weaned off the seed and have to live on its own roots. Up to V2, that plant has basically been living off of nutrients stored in the seed. That's the purpose of the seed. The seed is to feed the seedling corn plant until it gets big enough and it's got enough roots under it that it can fend for itself. Well, if it doesn't have a great root system yet, or it's in a part of the field that something is restricting its ability to develop roots, such as compaction, such as a heavy area of residue, such as a cooler soil, such as a tighter soil, such as a wetter soil. You guys all know everything that makes corn grow slower. Those are the areas that are going to look a little rough when it has to, fend for itself. Basically, it's used up all the seed, and at that point, it's on its own to grow a good enough root system to feed itself and keep itself growing. And we're going to be able to see those. Sometimes you can see tire tracks in compacted, traffic patterns in fields. Sometimes you can see the direction the combine cut the field of beans the year before. These big heads, in most cases, we can't spread soybean residue 40 feet. And if you can, you've got some special attachment on your combine to help it throw it that far, because you can't throw a feather 40 feet. And so we get these heavier, rows of residue out there. And even if you're doing tillage, in some cases, even if you're doing a lot of tillage, there's still more residue in that spot. Now, you may have mixed it into the soil, but there's still more residue in that spot. And oftentimes it's sulfur that's the primary nutrient that those plants are having a hard time getting. So you've heard me talk before about sulfur. One thing that sulfur will definitely do for you is it will kind of mask some of those challenges that's going on in that field. And it will help those areas that, are struggling more than it will help the areas that are not struggling. So if your fields, look perfect, and then kind of go through that ugly stage where they look less than perfect, that's what's going on. If they get really ugly, that may mean we've got some issues with residue distribution. It may mean we worked a little wet. It may mean we planted a little wet. It may mean we've got some sidewall compaction. It could mean that we don't have good nodal root development in that crop. So, it's going to be related to either the availability of the amount of the nutrient in that spot, the availability of the nutrient in that spot, or more likely the ability of the plant to take it up based on, how good of a root system does it have. But you're going to be seeing that, starting to see signs of that already in places. Adam's got some corn that's probably 6, might be V6 stage of growth. Going north, I'm starting to see some V3, pushing V4 corn. And that's usually, about that V3, V4 stage is where you really start to see that unevenness in color. It usually doesn't get terribly uneven in size. It's more of a color response. And of all the nutrients that we deal with, sulfur is the most correlated to color. It's even more correlated to color than nitrogen is. Anytime somebody sees pale corn, what's the first thing you think of? You think nitrogen. I would ask you, when you see pale corn, think sulfur, and you'll be right, more often than not, if you assume that sulfur is probably what that plant's having a hard time finding. So we touched a little bit on V5 fungicide. I'll circle back to that. So I would say, if your corn is getting posted at V4 or smaller, I would tell you probably not to invest in a foliar fungicide at that stage. I just don't think those plants are big enough to catch enough product to give you the bang for your buck that you're looking for. V4 to me would be the minimum size that I would be okay spraying a fungicide on. V5 would be, the size that gets talked about. V6 and V7 are great times for fungicide, not so great times for herbicide. And so that window where the corn's big enough for fungicide, small enough for herbicide, is pretty small. And I'm a big proponent of V5 fungicide in corn, but I'm an even bigger proponent in managing your weeds correctly and managing your herbicides correctly. So if the weed control program you're on and the post-emergent herbicide that you're going to use has to be sprayed on V2 corn or V3 corn, then do that and do that correctly, and don't put a fungicide with it. If you can utilize a post-emergence program that can go on V5 corn, then I would absolutely have a fungicide in that application. Also be aware, and we saw a lot of this last year, some people got a little fizzed up over this last year. Fungicides are an oil-based formulation. So if you put fungicide in with your early post herbicide program, that is another product going into that mix. That is another source of oil and emulsifiers going into that mix. And it does warm up that mix a little bit versus, what it would be without that fungicide in there. Now, they do not impact, the crop safety of that application near as much as adjuvants can, but just be a little bit eyes wide open about it, that, everything you throw into the tank could be foliar fertilizer, could be fungicide, could be surfactant, could be a crop oil of some kind. It could be a herbicide, could be insecticide. Everything you put in there is going to impact the potential for phytotoxicity, which is just a fancy term for crop injury or burn. Now, typically, those cosmetic burn situations do not really have any lasting impact on the crop. I don't think they're negatively affecting your yield. I'm more worried about the, metabolism based, issues where you get a lot of herbicide into a plant and it's got to metabolize that herbicide. If it's just an oil contact type burn scenario, that's not doing any more damage to that crop than a hailstorm would do. And if you've ever had hail on small corn, yeah, it looks like hell, but you usually don't get anything out of your hail insurance because it usually doesn't hurt your corn. And I would say the same thing about if you get some surfactant burn on some corn. But we had some of that last year. I wouldn't be surprised if this corn crop is pretty tender. When we've had not a lot of hot, dry days, you don't have a lot of cuticle or waxy layer buildup on those corn leaves. And I would guess this corn crop is pretty succulent and probably going to be pretty easy to burn. So if you had some issues last year where you were burning corn more than you wanted to with your post-emergence application, to me, the conditions this year, could lead to some of that as well. I see a lot of stuff popping up in the chat there, Adam. So
yeah, there's a good portion of me, but
okay, all right.
So
you don't have to chat in your questions; you can just ask them.
Actually, I was chatting in some of my thoughts on a couple things, adding to what you had.
I got a backdoor agronomist sneaking into the chat there.
But Merle did have a question or comment, I guess, if you'll.
That's all right, Merle. A lot of my questions are actually a comment veiled as a question. I like to say so.
So Merle says, I'm seeing more horizontal growing underground, and I don't think that the corn will ever emerge than in the past. Am I the only one seeing this?
Yeah. So no. So I've seen a lot of corn that I would call it leafed out underground this year. I don't know if yours is leafing out yet or if it's just confused and doesn't know what way is up. Sometimes a seed will start out growing down or start out growing sideways. And I've even seen them before where the mesocotyl will do a 360 around the seed and then start growing up. A little bit of that is the orientation of the seed, depending on what way the seed's laying. And there have been people that have proposed, maybe we need to design a multi-million-dollar planter that can orient the seed so that mesocotyl is going to start growing up and doesn't have to figure out which way up is. Plants have an ability called geotropism to grow against the pull, the gravitational pull. So a corn plant knows which way's up, but depending on which way they're laying, it might start growing, down before it figures out which way's up. And in some cases, that's what delays emergence, because that plant had to grow a quarter to a half an inch further than his neighbor, who was laying in the trench, the easy way, and was able to start growing straight up. So as far as what causes a plant to not grow straight up, if it's not related to the soil conditions, that can be an impact of chilling injury or stress or herbicide. It's not necessarily common for herbicide to be the cause of that. I think it's more often stress and environmental conditions. If you get a plant that's been struggling for 2 to 3 weeks to come up and it's growing slow, if anything causes that tip to rupture or break or bend, that plant's most likely going to leaf out underground. And unless it happens to stumble out of the ground through a crack, or let's say it was just a 1/16 of an inch underneath the surface when it leafed out, it might bust through the surface. It's going to come out all gnarled up, twisted up. It's going to look like kind of that classic, buggy whip, herbicide injury from group 15 herbicides that we talk about. Usually those plants, if they get up, they will get themselves straightened out. Eventually, they're going to look like hell for a period of time, but they are growing. The fact that they're growing abnormally, they're still developing. They're not that much younger than the neighboring plants. And if they can bust through the whorl and release those leaves and start growing normally, I would say more than half of those plants, if they're able to get out of the ground, are going to have a pretty good year on them. So if you've got 2,000 or 3,000 plants that are twisted up, you could probably, I'd feel comfortable assuming that at least half of those are going to contribute positively to society and produce yield for you in that field. But I would say there has been more than normal amount of corn that is leafed out underground or acted confused. Generally speaking, that was, in some of those earlier stressful planting windows where we just were not accumulating a lot of heat units. There could be some chilling injury that was involved in some of that just from really cold soils. Seed quality can factor into that. So if you're seeing that in a particular hybrid, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a seed quality issue. But if there are hybrid differences that you're seeing, that's something to make us aware of, and might be something there that we want to investigate a little further. But just as a rule, I would say there's a lot of corn that did not come up as well as the guy that planted it assumed it was going to the day that he planted it. There are some tough days in parts of my territory. April 15th is emerging as a pretty tough day to have planted corn. That would have been, I think, the Saturday after Easter. And that week of April 10th was a pretty good planting week. But at the end of that week was a rapid cool down phase and a rain event. And the closer you planted to that rain event and that rapid cooling, the more the crop struggled. The following week was a pretty harsh week to plant as well, because it was just bitterly cold. So there's a lot of planting dates and I need to sit down and kind of look back through the calendar and do a little work on, every year we can look back and see what were the days that we'd have been better off not to have planted. And we'll have some of those. The flip side of that, there were people that were being extremely patient and waiting for what looked like a good day to plant. And depending on how much of a stickler you are for weather forecast, soil conditions, and soil temperature, it might have been about May 5th before you had your first good day to plant. So there were people that
Merle says that his worst field was planted May 4th.
so that there's a possibility. One thing I will call out, and I don't want people to overreact to this statement, but for you guys that are no-tillers and like to throw 2,4-D in with your corn pre-emergence applications and no-till, be aware that the combination of a group 15 corn herbicide and 2,4-D, it's not off-label. You didn't do anything wrong. Whoever sprayed your field didn't do anything wrong. But putting those two things together will increase your odds of having corn that grows a little bit funky and doesn't come up as good as you would like it to in certain situations. So the pre-emergent chemistry people will blame the 2,4-D. The 2,4-D people will blame the pre-emergent chemistry issue. It is not off-label on anybody's label, but it's one of those things that takes your odds from 1% of having a problem to 5% of having a problem. Your odds of having a problem are still low, but they're higher if those two things are together. If you've got, situations where you've got open seed trenches and you get product down into the seed trench, down close to the seed, depending on when it got activated, when it got rained, lots and lots of factors, temperature, soil type, all that can enter into that. So there are actual situations where the presence of a herbicide is going to impact emergence. And if you've got stuff that appears to not know which way is up, that did not go through a lot of cold soil conditions, then I would be a little bit concerned that there could be a herbicide playing a role in that. If the seed was in the ground for 3.5 weeks and it went through a freeze and it had a lot of rain on it and it had lots of other issues going on, herbicide would not be the first thing that would come to mind. But if you've got corn that went into warm soils that should have been out of the ground in a week, and it is struggling for some reason, might be something to look into.
Hey, Jordan says he's been doing some digging around, finding some wire worms. He's wanting to know what part of the plant do wire worms feed on? How big of an issue is that?
Okay, so wire worms will eat about anything. They can eat the seed. So sometimes you'll dig up a seed that didn't grow and you'll find a wire worm had eaten, hollowed out that seed. They can also eat the shoot as it's coming up through the soil and prevent the plant from emerging that way. And bigger plants, you'll be walking through a field and you'll see say a V3 corn plant, and the two youngest leaves will be dead. So you've maybe seen this before, but you've got your first leaf, second leaf, here's your third leaf. So V3 corn plant. The fourth leaf here isn't completely out yet, and here's the fifth leaf. These two leaves will be wilted or brown and dead. I drew that right in the glare from the light. And the three older leaves are still green. So that means that wireworm actually fed and killed the growing point on that corn plant. The whole plant's going to die, but the new growth dies first. And I refer to that as it kind of killed the heart of the corn plant. So wireworms can eat the seed. They can eat the seedling as it's emerging, and they can continue feeding on emerged seed and kill those plants, or they can just do a little bit of damage, maybe add stress to the plant, maybe make it more likely to get infected with a seedling blight. So the 500 level of Poncho that is on virtually all DeKalb seed does a pretty good job of giving you wireworm protection. Granular insecticides can offer some protection from wireworm. It varies a little bit based on the product and the application method. The 1250 rate of Poncho, which is on some seed, but not a lot of seed, would give you the best seed protection, in my opinion, from wireworm. And if you had the ability to know what acres of your farm were going to be impacted by wireworm, and only spend an extra $25 an acre to control them in that spot, it would be well worth doing, because they can ruin a stand of corn. Now fortunately, they typically only ruin stands in small little spots. They don't ruin the whole field, but they can be extremely devastating, and they are pretty tough little boogers. And a seed treatment's not going to give you perfect control. A granular insecticide is not going to give you perfect control. And if you want to be loaded for bear against wireworm, you'd be spending an extra $25 or $30 an acre on every acre of corn you farm, which typically is not justifiable. Now, wireworms are unique in that their life cycle is 7 years. So if you have a field that has a bad wireworm issue, it is possible, depending on where that wireworm is at in its life cycle, and it's very difficult to know this, it's possible that every time that field is in corn for a period of a few years, you could see more wireworm damage. So if you do find a field that has a problem, you might make a note of that in the back of your mind. And 2 years from now, when that field's back in corn, maybe we should consider doing something a little more aggressive to protect that field from wireworm. There is no rescue treatment that I'm ever heard of that would be effective. You have to put on a high rate insecticide seed treatment, or a granular or a liquid product. So some of the liquid fungicides are actually the in-furrow applications are some of the better, wireworm preventions out there. So there are things you can do, but you would have had to have done them at planting, and not much we can do now other than if it gets bad enough, replant.
Yeah, a lot of times I see them the word, like if you got grass waterways, it's usually worse along grass waterways, because I think they like to lay their eggs in the roots of grasses.
And I probably see them maybe a little more commonly in fields that get manure applications. They're maybe a little more common in a no-till environment, but they can show up sporadically. When Kevin Steffi, Dr. Steffi, was at U of I as an entomologist, he used to joke that they would try to do research on wireworms are in a group like grubs and other things. We call them secondary pests, and they would get all these questions from producers about, well, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? What do I need to do? Well, they would set up an experimental trial. They'd go to a field that had a history of wireworm damage, and they'd do a plot to evaluate different products on wireworm. And inevitably, no wireworms would show up. And he used to joke that if you want to ensure you're not going to have a secondary pest problem on your farm, have me do a trial there, and they'll never show up. So they're very hard to predict where they're going to show up. And generally speaking, you're probably financially better off to almost ignore them than you are to try to control them on every acre you farm. Because if you try to control them on every acre, you're going to be wasting money on a lot of acres, and you may waste more money than you're going to make on the acres that actually need protection from wireworm. But they can make a mess out of a field of corn if the population is high enough, and they're going to keep feeding for a while. So until that corn's, I would say, once it's V6 or bigger and that growing point's above the soil line, they can't really do a lot of damage to it at that point. But as long as the growing point's still beneath the soil, they can still kill corn.
And the warmer it gets, typically they tend to go deeper into the soil profile.
Yeah, they're a cold soil early season pest. So when the soil is warm, they're going to go deeper in the soil, and that's going to take them further away from the growing point of that corn plant. So Adam's absolutely right about that. Anything else in the chat, Adam, before we get back on the list?
No, I think we're caught up with everybody.
Okay, great questions this morning, guys. Appreciate that. So Adam had a call out relative to volunteer corn. So there are some areas that had some pretty severe windstorms prior to harvest last fall, and might be dealing with some pretty heavy populations of volunteer corn as we're getting ready to head into post-emergent soybean spraying season. And yes, we are in post-emergent soybean spraying season. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. But bear in mind that volunteer corn is easiest killed when it's small. Bear in mind that coverage is important. Bear in mind that surfactants can be important. Bear in mind that a lot of the things that we spray in soybeans these days can be antagonistic to our conventional soybean grass herbicides, which is what we use to control volunteer corn. So for lots and lots of reasons, if you got bad volunteer corn, you may occasionally need to make an earlier post-emergence application than you were planning to. I've seen a few fields over the years that actually needed sprayed for volunteer corn twice. Should have done it once early when it was small, and then hit it again late to catch the stuff that came up later. If you wait too late and let the big stuff get, it's hard to kill volunteer corn that's over knee high. And you start getting into coverage issues, because when it's bad, you got a whole bunch of little stuff down. That sometimes happens when you got an ear that's growing. When you got a whole ear that's growing, there's a lot of little stuff down inside the big stuff, and you're probably not going to get good coverage on that. So the three things that I think impact volunteer corn control the most would be coverage would be a big one, because when you're doing everything you can do to control drift with large spray droplets and drift control additive, that is not the proper setup for good volunteer corn control. Then we've also got, in some cases, the adjuvant package for the volunteer corn product would be different than the adjuvant package for a lot of the other herbicides that are in the tank. And you might not be optimizing your adjuvant package for your volunteer corn herbicide. You're probably optimizing the adjuvant package for the other herbicides that you have in the tank. And then, oh, by the way, growth regulator herbicides, which would be 2,4-D and dicamba, can antagonize soybean grass chemistry. And group 15 products can antagonize volunteer corn chemistry as well. So we are spraying with poor coverage, with the wrong adjuvants, and a lot of antagonism. So the way we overcome that typically is by jacking up the rate of that volunteer corn product. And we've learned the hard way over the past 4 or 5 years. You can't, if you want to spray a low rate to control your volunteer corn, you need to spray that product by itself in water with ammonium sulfate and some crop oil. And if you do that, it'll work as good as it ever has. By the time you mix it in with everything else that we're doing and figure I'm only going to make one pass, that's where we come up with some of these challenges. So just be aware that you don't want to let that volunteer corn get too big, and be aware if you got a field that's really nasty and you need to make damn sure it works, don't be chintzy on your rate. Using a few extra ounces isn't really going to change the overall cost of your soybean program significantly, versus what it's going to cost to make another pass to go back and clean up what you don't get. Usually volunteer corn is just hurting your pride, but when it's bad, it might be the worst weed problem you have. I've seen some fields where volunteer corn actually smothered out the water hemp. That's good water hemp cultural control there, but not good. So if you're dealing with that, keep those factors in mind. While we're on the subject of post soybean spraying, I know the beans are small. I know you've been worried about them coming up for the last month, and now some dummy's telling you it's time to spray them, and you're thinking, well, that's crazy. Those little things are that tall. They just came up. How long has it been since your pre-emergence chemistry went on? For some of you, it's probably approaching 60 days. Ideally, we say the post trip should be made within probably 30 days of when your pre goes on. Now, I'll stretch that out a little bit when it's cold and dry, and that pre is going to probably hang around a little longer. But absolutely, within 3 to 4 weeks of soybean emergence, for sure. Some things will say from soybean planting. Well, sometimes when people say you should spray 21 days after planting, they don't realize it's going to take 30 days for the beans to come up after planting. So we can, in some cases with really early planted beans, we can stretch that a little bit, but we've probably already stretched it a lot in some cases. And the idea of overlapping residuals, and you put out residuals before planting, you're going to add, I hope, additional residual to your post application. For those residuals to be overlapping, the post residual has to be activated before the pre residual quits working. If you put your pre residual on 60 days ago, it's already quit working. Your field may still look relatively clean if it's done a good job, while it's been out there, but it's not doing a good job today if it's been in the soil for 60 days. If it's been in the soil for 30 days, it's starting to lose its punch. So if you're spraying your beans post when they're small, when you can't even see any weeds, when you're wondering, why in the hell am I doing this? I don't need to be here yet. It's too early. You're actually doing it just right. So keep going. I see, yeah, attaboy. Yeah. I see far more issues from fields that look like they needed sprayed than the fields that you're wondering, well, why am I doing this? Because there's nothing out here. Because there's always something there that they're just small, so you don't notice them, but they're there. And, that additional residual that we're putting on with that post trip, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck out of that product if it lands on the soil versus landing on foliage. And you've got a lot more likelihood of getting an activated rain timely the earlier in the season you spray. And oh, by the way, June 12th is going to be here someday. And people think June 12th is a big deal. Well, when you spray your beans post-emergence on May 20th, June 12th ain't no big deal. So keep that in mind as well. You're better off to be early for a whole host of reasons. There's almost never a good reason to be late. There's lots of good reasons to be early. So err on the early side. I know we got corn to post. I know we got everything. We got people still planting. We got corn that's ready to post. We got beans that are ready to post. We got bean burn down that needs to go on. I've seen some no-till cornfields that haven't been sprayed yet, that are getting a little rough to look at. So we got a lot of work to do in the weed control space in the coming weeks. But we are absolutely in the post-emergent soybean window, and if you're on somebody else's soybean system and they're telling you they want to wait and they're telling you they want to spray bigger weeds, well, you go right ahead and do that, because that's just going to make that system look not as good as it would have if you would have got it sprayed earlier. So it's good. It's good for me and my system if other people want to manage their system differently, because I don't care what kind of herbicide program you're doing in soybeans, you want to be spraying small weeds post emergence, and weeds don't stay small very long, as you know, and you're almost always better off to be earlier than you needed to be. Earlier than you needed to be is not a bad thing. Later than you needed to be is often a bad thing. So err on the side of being early. Comment or question, Adam?
Yeah. So Tom chimed in, had a great question. He says, extend application, talk about spraying early. What does early mean for your extend application?
Okay. So I would say, early to me would be when a lot of the field still looks clean, and the biggest weed you can find in the field is maybe 2 inches tall, and you've got a lot of bare ground. That's early. It's not too early. I would say that's a timely would actually be a better term for that, because when I call it early, that gets people nervous, because everybody's since Roundup,
Yeah.
people have been deathly afraid of being too early. If you were as afraid of being too late as you were being too early, the world would be a better place. But we have created this environment where everybody's worried about, I don't want to be too early. I don't want to be too early. Just try to be too early once, and you'll be timely. So, I mean, we've done this in trials, Tom. We have sprayed. The system actually works pretty good. If you put down a residual of your choice, you plant your beans, and you post spray dicamba, Roundup, and additional residual 30 days after you put your pre on. That works damn good. We've done that in trials for years. Works really good. And I have actually post sprayed. I did this last year. I post sprayed some beans one time that actually weren't up yet. And you'd be amazed at how clean that field stayed. So that's, if your beans aren't up yet, that would be the definition of really early for that's not even a true post application if the beans aren't up yet. But, and you got to be doing, things right. You need that additional residual in the tank. You're going to get a lot of people kind of got it in their head that they didn't think that post emergence residual was really doing much. And when you spray it in July on beans and weeds that are that tall, it don't do crap other than cost you money. But when you're putting it on in May on beans that are maybe that tall, and you got a lot of bare ground out there between those rows of itty bitty beans, then you get a lot of benefit out of that product, and you're more likely to get it activated timely as well. And that activation piece is critical. I mean, that's the nice thing about dicamba. Dicamba takes very little moisture for activation. Everything that we use in soybeans for residual control other than dicamba actually takes quite a bit of moisture for activation. And dicamba is a great dry weather, weed control hedge, basically. If it's too dry to activate your true residuals, if it doesn't rain, dicamba is a very strong residual. Now, once it's rained an inch, it's done. But once it's rained half an inch or 3/4 of an inch, your true residual is activated at that point. And it doesn't matter that your dicamba no longer has residuals, because the true residuals that were in the tank with it are now activated and working for you.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point, Lance. And, I think to our marketing's credit, we're sending out, and other companies for that matter too, with dicamba products, are sending out a lot of information promoting everybody to go early.
Right.
And I think it's early compared to conventional thought versus
Yes.
necessarily
truly
truly being early.
Yeah.
Timely would probably be a better term to use.
Yeah.
But compared to what everybody wants to do, because we all got spoiled during the Roundup days,
Yeah.
we waited for everything to be 2 foot tall before we went and sprayed it.
Yep.
It's really not early. It's
Yeah.
really
Yeah. We're not, the goal is not for your dead weeds to become mulch that prevents additional weed growth the rest of the season. So we don't want the weeds to be big enough they make mulch when they die. Let's talk about soybean stands a little bit. I'm a little out of order here. We're talking about post-emergence control. Now we're talking about stands, but I know a lot of you were pulling your hair out, wondering if your beans were ever going to come up. In most cases, they did. In most cases, they were fine. There was some replanting, but Adam and I were talking about what's the best way to do a stand count in soybeans, and to know if the stand is leavable. Now, if you do soybean stand counts for a living, you probably don't even need to do one. You can just walk in a field and go, "Well, it's probably about 70,000. That'll get me by. That's fine." But if you want to actually count stands and know exactly what you got, how do you do that? And it's going to vary with row spacing. I mean, 30-inch rows are the easiest. 15s are probably the most challenging, in my opinion. Drilled beans were easier than 15-inch row beans because with drilled beans, the hula hoop method worked really nice. I don't like using a hoop for 15-inch rows because if you position the hoop precisely, which you're not supposed to do, you can actually sometimes get 3 rows in the hoop. That's kind of cheating. Or you can throw it and always get at least 2 rows in the hoop. But the problem with the hoop method or just looking at 2 foot a row is it's a very, very small sample size. And small sample sizes are okay if you've got 100 of them. But if you get out of your truck, walk 10 feet, throw a hoop, count 6 plants in the hoop, and if you got my patented 28.3-inch diameter hoop, 6 beans in that 28.3-inch hoop is 60,000. And you go, okay, well, I'm not gonna live with 60,000. This field needs replanted. What if the rest of the field was 110,000? Or what if the rest of the field was 90,000? So if your worst spots are 60, I would ask you to stay out of that field and leave it alone. And don't go back to it every day and keep looking at it and driving yourself crazy. Now, if you've got an average of 60, we need more plants. But if the worst spots you can find are 60, 60 is enough to live with. Now, it's not ideal. And I get it. You're like, well, Lance, if 60 is enough, why in the hell did I plant 140? Well, I get that. But if you'd have planted 60, you wouldn't have 60. So you planted 140 to have 60, honestly, is what I would say. Now, that's a little bit of a smart ass answer, but for those that know me, that doesn't surprise you. Now 60 is not what I'm shooting for, but 100 is probably what I'm shooting for. So 100 is not thin. 100 is probably optimal. I plant 120, 130 a lot. A lot of people are planting 140. If you're planting more than 140, I'd probably challenge you to consider lowering your population, assuming you're planting treated seed and assuming you're doing a good job getting that seed placed with a planter. But back to stand counts. I'd have a measuring tape with me. I would measure out about 5 feet with the tape. I'd lock it. I'd lay it down next to a row, and I'd count how many plants I can count in 5 feet. And then all you need to do is some math and figure out how many feet seeds per foot of row do I have. And there's just some numbers that are burned into my brain. So 8 per foot in a 30-inch row is 140,000. So 4 per foot in a 15-inch row is 140,000. So that means 2 per foot in a 15-inch row is 70,000. So Adam, what does 2 per foot of small beans and 15-inch rows in no-till corn stalks look like?
Pretty thin.
Crap is what it looks like.
Yeah.
But it's 70,000 plants. And you're probably not going to increase your yield potential by interseeding into 70,000 plants. You could make yourself feel better. You could make your field look better faster. You probably won't make it yield more. Now that's the very bottom. Most of you would not live with 70,000 plants. And if conditions were so harsh that you've got 70,000 plants, you've probably got spots out there where you got 20,000 plants. And we got to do something with that field. But if you're just trying to do stand counts in soybeans in 15-inch rows, I'd use a tape measure. I'd lay out 5 feet. I'd find out how many, and you got to do that more than one spot. Walk around the field, do that in several spots. And if the worst you can find is 60 or 70,000, stay the hell out of that field with a planter. Now, if the best you find is 60 or 70,000, well, that's different. We're going to have to do something there. In our population trials, we've had 40,000 drop, yield over 80. Now, it's never won the trial. There's been some other population that's yielded more than 80, but soybeans are amazing with what they can do. I actually planted a little population demo in my plots at Monmouth, where we planted 40, 80, 120, 160, and 200. And we're just gonna, it'll be fun to, maybe sometime in August I'll bring a plant in that was planted at 40, and I'll bring a plant in that was planted at 200. And that one that was planted at 200 is going to look like a stick, and it's going to be laying over like this, and it's got 4 pods on it. And the one planted at 40 is going to look like a freaking soybean bush tree with probably 300 pods on it. So soybean's an amazing plant. We got to have enough for weed control. And if you get much less than 60, 70,000, your weed control is going to get a little sketchy because you just don't have enough canopy. But anyway, so that's my sermon on soybean populations. So we're probably coming up. Where are we at on time, Matt? We're at an hour here. So a couple other things. So I want to shout out. So 2 weeks will be our next episode, which I think is June 1st, right? Adam?
Yep.
So I'm going to have Dr. Cody Evans with me. So Cody is a weed management TDR. So I'm kind of the salesy agronomist, and then we have the research agronomists, which are our TDRs, and Cody is one of those focused on chemistry. And he's going to be on with me to talk a lot about weed management, and we will still be in the heat of the battle from post-emergence applications on June 1st. So it'll be really good timing to have Cody on with me, and he's a sharp dude and a lot of fun to talk to. So looking forward to having Cody on as a guest host. And I also want to give a shout out. So I had a viewer that sent me an email this week and said some very kind things about how much he liked Ask the Agronomist, and he ended it with he wanted to see more Dan Shaw on Ask the Agronomist. So I'm gonna have to kick Adam out for an episode and get Dan back in here to be producers.
This person that was saying all these things, that wasn't Dan.
No. I mean, now Dan and this guy are such good friends that you might say it was kind of like Dan saying that, but no, it was not Dan that was asking for that. So we may get Shaw back in here as a fill-in producer at some point. So anyway, a lot of fun here with you today. Appreciate all the great questions. This is probably the most questions we've had in several episodes. Really appreciate that. And thanks again for joining. Everybody stay safe, be timely with your post-emergence weed control, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. So take care.